and they can say, you know what, it's okay if I'm wrong because I'm still okay. I'm working towards something deeper, bigger, or more purposeful than the thing that my fragile ego says was the thing that success was. If there isn't that self-reflection and that vulnerability, as you said, some of those questions and some of those findings are really hard. What are we designing? Who are we trying to serve? Do they need this? What actually do they need? And maybe it's different than the thing that I needed. Our ancestors, Helen, didn't use the word naive in a negative way. It actually just meant natural or innate or genuine or that thing which was in you from the start.
This is Because People Matter, a podcast about celebrating leaders who are harnessing the gift of human differences, creating inclusion while driving success in their organizations and communities. Hosted by Dr. Helen Fagan, each episode features interviews with individuals who are leading the way. If you're ready to learn the impact becoming inclusive can have in your business, this is the podcast for you.
Welcome back, everyone, to Because People Matter. So today, we get to hear from a friend of mine. His name is Joshua Berry. He's the founder of an organization called Econic. And he is also the author of a book called Dare to be Naive. And he has a different way of us thinking about the word naive and some of the roots of that. So I'm really excited to have you join us in this episode and hear more about the approach to being naive and what we can learn in the process. Hi, Joshua. Welcome to the Because People Matter podcast. We're excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Helen. This has been something I've been looking forward to all week.
So you have a really fascinating story. I was reading that by the age of 15, you had lived in 15 different places. And the title of your book is Dare to be Naive. So how do you think that living in 15 places by age 15 shaped your willingness to be naive?
It probably could have gone in a couple of different directions, that much transition, but I think it made me much more adaptable, right? It was a constant new school. It was a constant new setting. And so I became very good at being able to read situations and people and whatnot. And this is where it could probably have gone in a couple of directions. Given some of those circumstances, I probably could have become much more cynical in how things were, or maybe the way life had been dealt to me. And yet at the other end of it, and I think this is what I landed more on, I continued to see that even through all of that transition, I was okay. And I think there's some of that like base understanding of what do you think is true and about where you're going and what you're doing, that even through a lot of transition, you're still here. And so I think that has kind of led into some of that naivete, and we'll get into it a little bit later, but the definition I use for naive is different than maybe what the typical world does. And so there's some of all that transition that also I think has gotten me to my own level of understanding my intentional naivete.
Yeah. And I really do like the way you use the word naive. The other thing that I thought was really fascinating is you have this interest in doing The Amazing Race. Tell me about that.
It's just been a dream. Our family has loved that reality show for years. And it's something about going and exploring the world and being open and appreciative of other cultures while doing it with someone that you really, in my mind, love and are solving these things together. I don't know. There's such a draw to it. Our family loves to watch the show. And so, yes, I've not only dreamt about this, but we have submitted applications and videos, and we haven't received the call back yet, but next season, Phil, we're coming for you next season.
I will be watching. So talking a little bit about your professional life, how did you get started in the work that you do? And, where did your passion for developing leaders and creating innovation in organizations come from?
Sure. Now, I studied international business in Spanish, and my first job spent about 10 years working at a company that was focused on the audacious idea of what would the world be like if everybody did what they were good at and enjoyed. And I think that just fueled my fire. back to all the transition that I had as a kid, I think I was also always in a search for who am I? What difference am I trying to make? Where might I be the best fit? And I then was in an organization who very much fed into that, helping me understand more of what my strengths were and places that I could play. And so I think there's some of that. I think in terms of leadership development, I had a manager when I worked at Hy-Vee back in the day who very early on saw some of my potential and made me a manager probably before I was ready. I was 16 years of age. He said, you know what, here's the keys to running the front end of the supermarkets. And seeing that vote of confidence and then the other ways that he invested in me and just created space for me to learn and try. And that I think that was one of the first instances that I had that I really appreciated the power of good leaders, as well as the fact that you could continue to help other people understand their leadership roles and how they could develop those.
Yeah. Oh, that is so good. When we think of really great workplaces, there's often a connection to the leader in that workplace. The quote is people don't quit jobs, they quit bosses.
100%. It's interesting that those first authority figures that aren't your parents, right? Or that are there in your life oftentimes come from those either school or your first jobs. They can help make and break a lot of things in you. And so there's such a good, strong power if we can develop leaders who can see how they can use that influence for good.
And I hope the leaders that are listening realize the impact that they're having on people, whether they recognize it or not.
Yeah,
They
I
do.
think you're right. Well, there's an exercise we'll do sometimes where we talk about encouragement and discouragement and the power that a leader has into that. And I always ask people to remember an encouraging leader and go back and try to recall the phrases that were used, the words, the situations, et cetera. And then we create a list of that. And then ask them to go back to a discouraging moment or leader and remember, I apologize, remember the words that were used, remember the actions that happened. And some fascinating things always fall out of that. Most people can find and recall a discouraging leader much more rapidly than an encouraging one. The memory that they recall is typically a lot older too, something they're held on to a lot more. And they typically can remember the emotions associated with it even more so than the encouraging leader. And so, yeah, there's such an impact that leaders can have on either direction.
Yeah. It sounds similar to an exercise we do when we are doing our leadership, inclusive leader development work, where we'll say, think of the most inclusive place that you've ever worked. What made it inclusive? Who made it inclusive? What was said? What was done? And then now, and we have people create a depiction of that using pipe cleaners. And then we'll say, think about the most non-inclusive environment you've been a part of. And the same thing. And then create this pipe cleaner. And then think about, and as you're creating the pipe cleaner, think about the impact it had on you in the depiction that you're making. So what you're saying, I think we could do those two activities together and it would be so fascinating to see the parallels between them, right?
Leaders do so much of priming the feelings and setting the stage of it being an inclusive or non-inclusive environment. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So Econic, you're the founder of Econic. Tell us what was the impetus that led you to create Econic, to found Econic as an organization? And then tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So after I left that first organization I described, I was out on my own doing consulting work. And in about 2015, started to see that I would be better if I had other team members around me. And that was when I co-founded Econic in December of 2015. And Econic has been through a number of iterations over the years. But as we approach our 10th year in 2025, what we focus most on is helping people create spaces to practice the behaviors that grow themselves and their organizations. And we do that through custom programming and facilitation and coaching and consulting that looks like everything from setting up innovation labs to custom design leadership development programs to strategy work with growing companies. And so there's a lot of different things that we do, but again, it all comes back to this heart of why I think was passionate about this at the beginning, which was we can use work truly as a vehicle to help people practice those behaviors I think we need more of in organizations, in families, and in societies.
Yeah, we need a lot of those skills that you're describing in our world, especially now.
Yeah. So we can
So,
help people be more empathetic, more curious, more open to other people's ideas, checking their assumptions against things, right? There's so many great skills that just happen to also be skills in the innovation or change spaces that are needed at work. Hooray, they get to practice those things on things that matter to businesses and practice those things that matter in their lives.
yeah. So, what do you think is the intersection? I'm curious, since you develop leaders with that innovation mindset and that empathy, those are just, we found in our research, are just such cornerstones of attributes of inclusive leaders. So, what are your thoughts on what's the intersection between that inclusive leader mindset and innovation, those innovative leaders?
If you start from the standpoint that I'm right, and therefore I need to defend and I'm closed off and I'm more committed to proving to you that I am right, you're not going to go very far from an innovation standpoint. I think there are stories out there, but they're more the exception where some brilliant leader has the idea and, be damned what other people say or think or the customers need. Like, I'm going to bring this thing to the world. There are way more success stories that start with people saying, who am I trying to serve? What problems do they have? What are they feeling? What are they needing? What are they wanting? And all of that has to be in alignment with someone who can include that other people's points of view, that other people's reality is important and worthy of being seen. And so we get to practice at the very beginning when people have new innovative ideas or change ideas or growth ideas, even about their organization, the testing of some of those assumptions that they have. And it is almost always through experience of going out and talking to those people and learning. And so often we get people who come back and say, I learned things that I didn't know, or somebody else believes this or thinks that. That's the opposite of what I would have thought. And so there's absolutely an intersection into being inclusive and finding business success if you need innovation or growth to be able to succeed.
Yeah, yeah. Checking our assumptions. Oh, wow. That takes a lot of courage. It takes a level of transparency with oneself. And then it takes a level of just being vulnerable.
It does. It comes back to maybe even the first question that you asked me. You have to be able to be like, and I'm still okay. I'm still here. I've gone through this change. I've worked through these things and I'm still okay. And the people who I've seen who are the best leaders who've been able to adapt through these changing times are those people who are able to know that they're more than just their ego, and they can use that to drive, and they can set it aside to say, you know what, there are other things that are out there, and it's okay if I'm wrong because I'm still okay, or I'm working towards something deeper, bigger, or more purposeful than the thing that my fragile ego says was the thing that success was.
Oh, yeah. So good. Such a great reminder. In your work, what have you found to be the barrier to innovation?
Oh boy, there's things at systems levels, teams levels, individual levels is what I'll say. At a systems level, there's so much of the things that got us here are the things that keep us here a lot of times. And I think that that's valuable because I think we're always like, oh, got to throw it out. Well, no, like the reason when an organization has grown to a certain size, there is more to lose. And you oftentimes need more of the processes and the policies and those sorts of things to be able to perpetuate or even to create equitable solutions to some people, right? There's systems that are important. And at times, those systems may stifle innovation because they're meant to perpetuate or they're meant to keep things in a certain way or reduce risk. And yet, innovation, many times in and of itself, is risky. So there are systemic things that can get in the way of innovation. There are definitely team practices of how we come together to do things, right? If there's, I'll just throw out a couple of low trust. There's no margin or time because all we have is just to get the stuff done, and we don't know how to prioritize what's really important, or we're always saying yes to everything. There's a bunch of practices there that get in the way of innovation. And then probably at an individual level, some of the things we've already talked about, which is, am I all right if I go out there and I learn something different than the way I thought it was? What does that mean about my identity, the stories I'm telling myself, my place in this organization, all of those sorts of things? And so if there isn't that self-reflection and that vulnerability, as you said, some of those questions and some of those findings are really hard. It's almost better. You see this. It's almost better to just keep building your innovative idea in a silo, in a silo, in a silo, and then bring it out to the world eventually and try to market it and sell it. And then if it doesn't work, blame marketing and sales on it. When in fact, you probably could have brought it out a lot earlier, been more inclusive in what are we designing? Who are we trying to serve? Do they need this? What actually do they need? And maybe it's different than the thing that I needed, and
I
building that in a
agree.
more inclusive way.
Yeah, that's really good. The thing that makes me think of, Joshua, is sometimes the thing that people need is the thing they resist the most.
I love the phrase, what you resist persists. And that's
Yeah,
exactly it. Like it keeps showing up to you.
it keeps showing up. And one thing that I have found in our work in developing inclusive leaders is, we have this 12-month framework because we know humans don't change very quickly. And we liken that in developing inclusive mindset, it's almost like going from being a person who's been sitting on the couch to being a marathon runner. And in order for you to be successful at that, you've got to put in the effort. You've got to train. And it has to be consistent and intentional, and you look for incremental gain. And so often the pushback we get is, golly, 12 months is a long time. Can you make it in 6 months? Can you make it in 3 months? Or can you, and, and I know you have found this too, that you want to work with those teams and organizations and leaders who are hungry for learning.
I agree. Many of the things that you and I work on and our teams work on are not quick fixes right away. And so you're right. You do need to find the right organizations and the right leaders who have it in them to work through those things. I've made mistakes in client projects in the past where I have tried to rush through things too quickly. This is semi-related to it, but I really appreciate some of the concepts and the work around spiral dynamics. And when you think about the levels of adult development or human consciousness, you can't skip those levels. And there's certain lessons that you need to have through that. And classic one is, being committed to things that are right from a dogmatic or unified codification, like if the government or religion or legal or whatnot, like that has to break down before you can kind of come back to it again at another point. Go through just on audio, don't see my hands here, but there's a pendulum swing that happens. And there was a time that I did a project with a client, and they were very much in this space of achievement and goal orientation. And I was trying to help them see another way of being that was maybe a couple of steps ahead. And it would have skipped over this like growth path of a more pluralistic, common, like flattening of some of the work that they needed to do to be able to build trust and confidence in each other, and then pick back up natural hierarchies. And I'm kind of talking in abstract to try to protect the client here. But when you skip ahead in development of a group or a leader or other things, it doesn't stick. Like to your point, there are those things that persist because sometimes they need to be dealt with so that you can, I'm a video gamer, so you can earn the next level or stage that you're supposed to get to and get to the next one. It's kind of hard just to skip all the way to the end at the boss fight.
I often use the analogy of the butterfly, going from larva to chrysalis and to becoming that process. And because I'm on a research grant with a group of entomologists, and we one of the things I learned is that if you help the butterfly when it's trying to come break out of the chrysalis, if you just go along and just peel back just one of the little pieces, that butterfly's lifespan is shortened because it is in the struggle that it becomes stronger and is able to expand its life
I think
and
that'd be
reach.
good. I like
Yeah.
it.
And I use that analogy often with the leaders that we work with. And I want you to struggle with this. I'm glad you're going through this. And they look at me like I'm got the horns growing out of my head. But lean into it, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah.
A mentor of mine, Chip Conley, runs a number of things, but one of them is the Modern Elder Academy. And he has a good TED Talk out there right now that talks about reframing the midlife crisis as the midlife chrysalis for that exact same thing, because there is a necessary struggle that happens through that you can resist, or you can wait and push through it and see what happens on the other side.
Yeah. Such a beautiful space the struggle isn't fun, but what comes out as a result of it is much more beautiful and resembles the larva that went in, but not exactly. It looks
Mm,
so much brighter and more
mm.
beautiful.
Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what do you see as some of the examples, I guess, that you've experienced of when there's been either spoken or unspoken beliefs
Mhm.
that limit a leader's ability to create equity in their practices, in their organizations?
That's a great question. The beliefs are almost always kind of hidden underneath the surface. And most of our conversations in teams or leadership groups are around the practices or the policies or that particular level. Work from home, remote work, hybrid work, in office policies are a great example. There's all these debates that are happening up at the should it be a 3-2 or should we be back 4-1 or is it all the time or who is it? Those are some of the conversations that I think would benefit more from what is driving our decision of why we believe we would benefit more from a 3-2 or why, or when the person is arguing for our people have to get into the office because culture can't happen if people aren't sitting near each other. Okay, where did that belief come from? Did you believe that to be true? And then what do you gain and what do you lose by holding the belief that culture is only built through people sitting near each other? And so being able to expose some of those beliefs are important. There's a project that we did with one organization where they were arguing a bit as a human capital leadership team about how they were dealing with the recent labor negotiations. And one group you could see was being more generous and the other group was being more protective. And both were framing it in great ways. We saw that we were coming to an impasse. And so during a break, I just put together with one of my colleagues a quick survey that was on some like base beliefs and principles ideas. Things like if people were given the chance to steal and not get caught, would they? Or I think people are trying their best. Just basic like belief questions. And then we asked this team to anonymously rate themselves on where they would say, would people steal if they wouldn't be caught or not? And do you think people are believing their best or not? And, of course, what happened was you saw that people were pretty split on some of their beliefs. And that was what was being reflected in the divisive discussions that they were having around the labor negotiations. And so we didn't do that to then highlight and say that group is wrong or that group is right, but we used it to be able to highlight that some of the things we're talking about are actually really deep-seated beliefs. And we're probably not in 20 minutes going to shift your belief, Helen, or that people are innately good, or that I believe that people are cheaters, right? So I think being able to help people see that there are some of those beliefs, and maybe when some of those become limiting beliefs, the first step in people being able to start to sense some different ways that they could try new practices or try new policies.
Those beliefs, the longer we've held them, the harder it is to break them.
Absolutely. We were digging into our pay policies for our internal company. And we started just saying, like, what are the beliefs that power how we pay people? And we had to unpack things and actually put in writing, like, either do we believe these or is this just what Western society believes? And we've copy pasted that. We're in a consulting training business. So people who are client facing are paid more than people who are internal or operational facing. Or a salesperson makes more than a client relationships person, right? And we had to unpack some of those and say, are we willing to own that? And back to even the framework that I shared before, do we believe it? Is it true? And at least what do we gain and what do we lose from that belief? For instance, client-facing people should be paid more than non-client-facing people. Okay, do we understand then, and can we at least illuminate some of those beliefs to then decide, do we want to rename or reshape what our beliefs are? And then from that, suggest different practices, like maybe shifting how we pay or making things a little bit more equitable and whatnot. And I think it ties back into inclusivity, because what we're doing is we're pausing and saying, here's something that I believe. Oh, now I'm actually going to name it, that's what I believe. And I'm going to claim that there are things that are good and there's things that are not so good about this belief. But you have to zoom out a little bit to see a bigger, broader picture to be able to enter into conversations like that.
Oh, such a great example. And it really points to another attribute of inclusive leaders in that they're willing to call out non-inclusive practices and then hold themselves accountable to shifting and changing those practices. Because sometimes people will call it out, but they don't want to do the hard work necessary to make that change, which what you just described is exactly what's happened in that
Yeah.
case. I love it. Great
Well,
example.
I'll share a shift in it. We claimed and we did say, you know what, because of the way we work with clients and all those things, yes, we are willing to claim and name that we will pay client-facing people more than others. But we started to say that there are other parts of our pay formula that maybe we don't want to reinforce that. And so it actually, all that discussion led to a shift in how we do any variable compensation or bonus structure. And we shifted away from something that continued to multiply the effect that we had there of some of those inequalities that we were okay with because we named it, and said, you know what, we're going to shift our profit share portion to a pure profit share based on hours worked. And so your 40 hours will get more profit share than my 30 hours, even if maybe I get paid twice as much for my 30 hours. And so again, to break that down, we had to take a step back and say, I don't know what got you to this point where your 60 minutes today had all the education, experience, whatever that got you into this role. But your 60 minutes is the same as my 60 minutes. And in this part of our compensation formula, we're going to reward it in that way. And so, but it only came from a reflection back on what our values are.
Oh, I love that. Such a great example. And honestly, such a wonderful model for individuals like myself as the founder of Helen Fagan Associates. And as we think about profit sharing with our team, how to do that and do it well in a way that's equitable. So thank you so much for
You're
sharing
welcome.
that.
You're welcome. It's still
really
not
good.
perfect. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out and I can share more nuts and bolts on it.
Yeah. So your book, I love the title, by the way, Dare to be Naive. Tell us about your definition of naive and how it helps people to truly unpack their beliefs or the way that they're practicing or things that they could use to improve.
Yes. So you're right. The book is called Dare to be Naive: How to Find Your True Self in a Noisy World is the subtitle. And there's a hint at what naive means in that subtitle about finding your true self. You see, when I went about researching the book and interviewing leaders and pulling in the anecdotes that I was going to use, I saw a common pattern that the people that I was talking to kept using this phrase, this might sound naive, but, and then would share some amazing idea or philosophy or truth. And it got me to think, like, why do we use this phrase of like, don't want to be seen as naive? And I went down a rabbit hole of what does naive actually mean? Where did the word come from? Why do we like fear it or use it as a shield in some ways? And what I found was astonishing. And that's that our ancestors, Helen, didn't use the word naive in a negative way. It actually just meant natural or innate or genuine or that thing which was in you from the start. And since we're in an inclusivity-based podcast here, I'll share with you that it only started to turn in a more pejorative sense when we were confronting colonialism and saying, hey, you know what? These natives, nativists, naifs, naive, they are bad. And we, or enlightened or hold reason, are superior. And so in the same spot, we started to like say no to more native wisdom or native approaches. And the word naive got carried along into that. And so I hold on to what does naive mean in a different sense. And I talk about it as not a binary, you're naive or you're not. I talk about it as a spectrum. And that, yes, on one end is being pragmatic and cynical. Other end is probably being willfully ignorant and the sort of naivete that people like push away from. But the world would benefit from all of us maybe taking a step a little bit closer to being naive in a chosen, rational, intuitive way that actually brings us back to things that are a little bit more genuine or natural or innate. And so that's some of the book's origin that's in there. And since that whole idea of what do you believe and what's natural or genuine to you, I use a framework throughout the book to be able to help people like reflect upon what is it that I actually believe and what is true to me in a number of different scenarios. And specifically, it's a lot of business ideas like prioritizing employee growth or how tightly you hold on to your intellectual property or just doing growth for growth's sake. Like these are all specific chapters in there. And not meant to say that's right or this is wrong, but they're all anecdotes and research around certain business topics that just poke people in the head and the heart a little bit to say, do you agree? Do you disagree? And where do your beliefs come from? And how do those shape your reactions to those things that were just shared?
Everything you just mentioned really sounds like you're helping people to think about, gain self awareness, which is part of emotional intelligence, and being real, which is, all those things about part of being emotional intelligent, and then being willing to grow, to be, so tying into that growth mindset. And we see in our work that growth mindset, those who are willing to grow, and those who are emotionally intelligent, we see those as being the vehicles that we use those ideas as vehicles to help develop those attributes of inclusive leadership. So does your book touch on those
Oh,
concepts?
absolutely. Like the entire thing is a growth mindset of needing to be open and curious and questioning those beliefs that you hold. So 100% there. And in terms of emotional intelligence, it's baked into there to your points of self-awareness, but then also empathy for others. Because to even start at the spot of, is this belief true? Which in some ways is almost a rhetorical question. But then what do I gain and what do I lose by holding this belief? You have to adopt a stance that there is something more than just probably me holding on to this belief. And so you have to be emotionally intelligent to be able to see what you're doing and where you're going through it. The other thing is I intentionally use some provocative or more progressive business ideas, and it's meant to evoke emotion within people. And I allow that at the end of the chapters. I'm like, did you think that was a terrible idea? Did you think that was like what caused something to stir within you? Now use that to now start to analyze what is it that you actually believe and apply a more rational framework to understanding their emotions and their intuition around things.
It reminds me, that emotional piece, what you just described, reminds me of when I do cross-cultural work with leaders, and I will ask them, who are you as a cultural being? And people will say, well, I don't know, I'm just a white, you know, person from, I don't know, I don't even know what my culture is. And getting them to recognize that those things that generate emotional reactions are your cultural values. And those were wired into you from the time you were very young. So, to the beliefs, the values, the norms, the attitudes, the expectations you have of people, put all of that together. That's the culture that you're operating within. And so I love that. And tuning them into your emotions are going to be telling you. So, like, if you've ever traveled internationally and, you go to some places and you're standing in line, the Brits call it queuing, and all of a sudden somebody cuts you off. If you have an emotional reaction to that, it goes against everything you learned about fairness and respect and waiting your turn. Well, by golly, your emotional reaction can teach you your cultural value right there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I
So,
think that
yeah.
this goes back to the idea of a lot of our practice of, to your point out around growth mindset, is being able to wake up to those moments where you spontaneously reacted in a way. And can that tell you something, right? Can you be curious in that moment? Mine, just since we're in admission time here, is when we're on an airplane and people will get up behind you and not let the people in front get off first, right? I catch myself all the time getting frustrated at those people. It's like, don't you understand the etiquette of how you deplane? And yet, in my best moments, when I'm not too sleepy and I'm not too hungry or any of those, I can catch myself and almost like laugh at it a little bit. Right? There's always that first reaction of like, "Argh." And then there's, if you work on it, there's that second reaction of like, wow, did you see? Like, why did it do that? And sometimes I can laugh at some of those things, but I think that's so important for leaders to practice that growth mindset and the emotional intelligence if they want to start to be able to zoom out to include more in those circles.
I've done that, the deplaning thing. It made me think of, I'll be driving to do a training on inclusion. My husband jokes with me and says, Helen, your internal clock runs 10 minutes behind everybody else. So I'm often running a little bit behind. And so I'll be trying to rush and get there, that kind of thing. And here's a person who's doing the speed limit and I'm not. And I'm getting frustrated. And then I look at their license plate and I'm like, oh, golly, they're from blah, 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 blah. And you see what I'm saying? The story that I tell myself about that, it's not because of that person doing anything. It's they've triggered something in me that I started it by being late, right? And then I will catch myself and go, yeah, that's really non-inclusive practice, Helen.
Well, there's so much. One of the things I talk to leaders a lot about is there's a study that shows that in every second, our brains are actually processing about 11 million bits of information, but our conscious minds can only handle 40 to 45 bits of information. And so we have to have so many things on autopilot to be able to even just help us function in the world. And so a lot of times those beliefs, the stories, the biases that you have in there, like they're not all bad. They help us survive in this world. And we can be more aware of those things. And we can be more aware of our second reaction and our first action to those things if we want to act on those. It's when we just allow that bias or the story or the cultural norm to go unchecked that we lose the opportunity to be a little bit more inclusive in our approach.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. So good. All right. I want to ask you one last question.
All right.
What would you tell the fresh out of college Joshua who's about to embark on his career? What advice would you give him?
I would tell them patience, and you don't have to be perfect. So much of my life that I keep chasing, like, am I right? Am I correct? Am I perfect? Am I the smart one in the room? Am I any of those things? And when you live in that for too long, you miss the opportunities for curiosity and wonder and being okay with being wrong and all of those sorts of things. And so, some of those achievements and things that I chased for the sake of achieving and trying to prove that I was right and whatnot are absolutely things that have helped me, and they're things that I've lost from that approach. And so I think I would give some of that advice, knowing my fresh out of college self. I probably wouldn't listen to me because I would have thought that I knew what was right. But at least I would attempt. I would attempt to help them to say, like, are you perfect yet? Nope, you're never going to. So maybe try a
Yeah.
different approach.
Oh, such good wisdom for our young listeners out there. Hopefully, they're listening and taking heed of the words of wisdom that you have shared with us. Joshua, I do think you are enough. I think you're brilliant and I think you're doing such a great job as a leader, as an educator, as a coach, as a husband and father. And kudos to you. And thank you for being part of our circle and spending time with us today.
Helen, thank you for this curious, empathetic, and fast and moving podcast. I can't believe this has already been that amount of time. Wow, this has been a treat.
This has been Because People Matter, a podcast about celebrating leaders who are harnessing the gift of human differences, creating inclusion while driving success in their organizations and communities. You can find links to any resources mentioned in today's show notes. Because People Matter is brought to you by Helen Fagan and Associates. We are changing the world one inclusive leader at a time. Go to helenfagan.com to learn more about what we can do for your organization. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. Thank you for listening.